The tobacco industry didn't just deny the science. They built an entire parallel scientific establishment: journals, laboratories, research grants, university chairs, and independent institutes, whose sole structural purpose was to manufacture doubt, not truth. For nearly 40 years, from 1954 to the early 1990s, this machine functioned with the precision of a Swiss watch. It produced thousands of pages of peer-reviewed research. It trained genuine scientists who genuinely believed in their work. It won genuine scientific awards. And its real product was never knowledge. Its real product was delay. Who profits from confusion? Who profits when a settled scientific question becomes controversial again? By the end of this story, you will understand exactly how doubt itself became a multi-billion-dollar financial asset, and why the same playbook is running right now on a different topic, perhaps as you watch this. 1952, a single magazine article. Reader's Digest published a piece titled "Cancer by the Carton." 28 million Americans read it. It was the first time the general public encountered, in plain language, the growing scientific suspicion that cigarettes caused lung cancer. Tobacco executives panicked over a magazine article. That panic, that one moment of fear in boardrooms in Richmond, Virginia, and Winston-Salem, North Carolina, is the seed of everything that followed. Not a courtroom. Not a Senate hearing. A magazine article and a stock ticker. Small fear. Massive consequence. This is the first economic principle hiding in this story. In industries built on perception, a single piece of information can threaten more capital value in one morning than years of competition ever could. Tobacco companies didn't fear lawsuits in 1953. Lawsuits were rare and usually won by the companies. They feared something far more dangerous to a business model: a change in belief. Hill and Knowlton's strategic genius, and you should understand this was genius, however dark, was recognizing a critical truth. You cannot suppress true information in a free society. But you can compete with it. So instead of fighting science with denial, they decided to fight science with more science. In January 1954, the tobacco industry created the Tobacco Industry Research Committee (TIRC), later renamed the Council for Tobacco Research. On paper, it was an independent, non-partisan scientific body. In reality, it was funded entirely by tobacco companies and run by a scientific director, Dr. Clarence Cook Little, who held public skepticism about the smoking cancer link. Why did this work? Because of a quiet flaw in how the public, and even journalists, interpret science. Most people cannot evaluate scientific evidence directly. They evaluate the appearance of consensus. If 10 studies say X and one says Y, most people assume genuine scientific uncertainty exists, even if the one study institution was custom-built to produce that single dissenting result. The TIRC didn't need to win the scientific argument. It only needed to make the public believe the argument was still happening. Between 1954 and 1989, the tobacco industry spent an estimated $300 million in inflation-adjusted today's dollars, well over $1 billion funding ostensibly independent research. They funded university laboratories at Harvard, Cornell, and other elite institutions. A standalone facility, the Council for Tobacco Research, employing genuine PhD scientists. A separate operation called the Tobacco Institute, focused purely on media and legislative messaging. International front groups in Europe and Asia, replicating the same model. Where does the money actually go in an operation like this? Not into a single bribe. Into infrastructure. Into decades of slow-drip legitimacy. Now pause the macro history. Look at one human being. Dr. Clarence Cook Little, Harvard-trained geneticist, former president of the University of Michigan, founder of the Jackson Laboratory, a legitimate and still respected cancer research institution in Maine. This was not a quack. This was not a hired liar in a lab coat. Little held a genuine, if increasingly outdated, scientific belief that cancer was primarily driven by genetic predisposition, not environmental triggers like smoke. When tobacco companies came calling, they weren't manufacturing a liar from nothing. They were finding the one respected scientist whose real beliefs already served their business interests, and giving him an institution, a budget, and a podium. This is among the most psychologically chilling parts of the story, because it removes the comforting fiction that this was simple villainy. Little likely went to bed most nights believing he was on the side of scientific rigor against premature, panic-driven conclusions. Confirmation bias, status, funding, and identity all aligned seamlessly with what tobacco companies needed him to believe. What changed inside a man like Little, decade after decade, as the evidence around him became undeniable? We don't fully know. He died in 1971, 2 years before the Surgeon General's reports had become entirely unambiguous, still publicly unconvinced. That's the emotional cost rarely discussed in this story. Not just the smokers who died, but the scientists who spent entire careers, genuine reputations, and intellectual identities propping up a position that history would judge as catastrophic. Was it greed? Partly. Was it pride? Almost certainly. Was it the simple, deeply human inability to admit, after 30 years, that you had been wrong the entire time? Perhaps all three. Let's name the mechanism precisely, because once you see it, you'll see it everywhere else in the economy. Doubt has a market value precisely equal to the amount of profit threatened by certainty. In 1953, cigarette sales in the United States generated retail revenue exceeding $6 billion annually, a staggering figure in mid-century dollars. The entire economic model of the industry depended on a single belief surviving in the public mind. Smoking is a personal lifestyle choice, not a medical risk. Every year that belief survived intact was worth, conservatively, hundreds of millions of dollars in continued sales, avoided regulation, and deferred litigation. So consider the math from the industry's chair. If you can spend $10 million a year funding independent research that merely sustains public uncertainty, not even disproves the cancer link, just keeps the question feeling open, and that uncertainty preserves a multi-billion-dollar revenue stream for even 5 more years. You haven't spent money on research. You've made one of the highest return investments in corporate history. This is the cold, structural truth beneath the human drama. Manufactured doubt isn't a moral failing that occasionally happens in industries under threat. It is, when modeled financially, often the single most rational allocation of capital available to a company facing existential scientific findings. The tragedy is that the math works. That's why it happened. That's why, as you'll see, it happened again. Could this happen again? It already had, and the people orchestrating it weren't even primarily scientists or PR men. They were lawyers. A 1969 internal memo from a Brown and Williamson tobacco executive, later unearthed during 1990s litigation, contained a sentence that should be carved into the entry of every business school in America. Doubt is our product. The memo continued, explaining that doubt was the best means of competing with the body of fact accumulating in the public's mind, and the best way to establish a controversy. Read that again. Doubt is our product, not cigarettes. Doubt, this single sentence, reframes the entire 40-year operation. The Council for Tobacco Research wasn't a research institution that occasionally produced PR-friendly findings. It was, by design, a doubt factory, with scientists as its unwitting assembly line workers. And the genius, the dark, undeniable genius, was structuring it so that the people inside the factory didn't know, or didn't fully admit to themselves, that this was the product being manufactured. Who profits when an entire field of science gets entangled in manufactured controversy for decades? Not just the tobacco industry. Lawyers build enormous hours managing litigation risk. PR firms built entire practice areas around issue management. And an entire shadow industry of regulatory consultants emerged, available for hire by any industry facing inconvenient scientific consensus. Tobacco didn't just buy doubt for itself. Tobacco invented the doubt manufacturing industry as a service, later sold to lead paint manufacturers, asbestos companies, fossil fuel corporations, and sugar lobbies. By the late 1970s, cracks were forming. The U.S. Surgeon General's landmark 1964 report had already concluded smoking caused lung cancer with sufficient scientific weight to alarm the public. Cigarette packages began carrying warning labels in 1966, weak ones, vague ones, but warnings nonetheless. Yet tobacco stocks didn't collapse. Sales didn't collapse. For nearly 30 more years after that 1964 report, the doubt machine kept functioning, kept buying time, kept preserving billions in annual revenue. Why does nobody notice how long a dying argument can be kept alive? Because institutional doubt doesn't need to convince everyone. It only needs to convince enough people, long enough, to delay regulation, delay litigation, delay the moment when a corporation must pay for the damage it created. Delay compounded over decades is itself a financial instrument. Every year of delayed regulation is a year of preserved cash flow. Every year of preserved cash flow can be reinvested, diversified, or extracted as dividends, meaning by the time the legal reckoning finally arrives, the original profits have already been converted into other assets entirely, often beyond the reach of litigation. This is precisely what happened. By the time of the historic 1998 Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, in which tobacco companies agreed to pay states $206 billion over 25 years to settle health cost lawsuits, the major tobacco companies had long since diversified into food brands, real estate, and international markets. The settlement, while historic, arrived decades after the doubt machine had already extracted its value. Behind every statistic in this story is a human cost too easily abstracted away. Researchers estimate that smoking-related illness killed approximately 20 million Americans between 1964 and 2014, a death toll that dwarfs every American war combined. Picture not a statistic, but a single ordinary moment. A teenager in 1962, in a high school hallway in Akron, Ohio, lighting her first cigarette because an advertisement told her smoking made her sophisticated, independent, modern. She had no access to internal memos. She had no idea that the very balanced news coverage reassuring her of ongoing scientific debate was being engineered, line by line, by men in a Plaza Hotel suite a decade earlier. She trusted the system. The system had been quietly purchased. This is the loneliest part of the story. The people most harmed were the ones with the least access to the truth, while the people manufacturing the doubt had the clearest view of the science all along. Internal tobacco industry documents from the 1950s reveal executives privately acknowledging the cancer risks in memos never meant for public eyes, even as public-facing statements insisted no proof existed. That gap between what was known internally and what was said publicly is where the real moral weight of this story lies. So return now to December 15th, 1953. The Plaza Hotel. The coffee cups. The folded newspaper. You now understand what was actually being built in that room. Not a single ad campaign. Not a momentary crisis response. A 40-year architecture for converting scientific uncertainty into shareholder value. The Frank statement wasn't really a statement of frankness at all. It was the founding charter of an entirely new industry, the professional manufacturing of doubt, sold not as a product but as protective infrastructure for any business whose core product turned out to be dangerous. The tobacco industry didn't invent lying. Companies had lied about products for centuries. What tobacco invented, refined, financed, and proved scientifically viable was something far more sophisticated, a methodology for keeping a lie alive using real scientists, real data, real peer review, and real institutions, for so long that the lie effectively became indistinguishable from genuine controversy. This is why almost nobody noticed at the time. There was no single villain to point to. There was a system, diffuse, plausible, populated by genuinely credentialed people, operating in the open, in journals anyone could read. The most dangerous form of deception in economic history doesn't hide in the shadows. It hides in plain sight, wearing a lab coat. The tobacco playbook didn't disappear when the cigarette industry finally lost its 40-year war. It migrated. Internal memos, later made public through litigation, show that some of the very same scientists, the very same PR strategists, and even the very same consulting firms that built tobacco's doubt machine went on to consult for other industries, facing other inconvenient scientific findings in other decades on other continents. The mechanism is industry agnostic. It requires only 3 ingredients: a product generating enormous profit, a body of inconvenient scientific evidence threatening that profit, and enough capital to fund an alternative version of science indefinitely. So here is the final, uncomfortable question this story leaves behind. If a single magazine article in 1952 was enough to trigger a 40-year, billion-dollar architecture of manufactured doubt, what inconvenient scientific finding, threatening some extraordinarily profitable industry, is being quietly studied right now in a research institute whose name sounds completely independent, funded by money whose true source you'll never see listed on the door? You may already be reading their research. You just don't know it yet.